The most powerful vice president in American history is dead, and his funeral just revealed everything about where our country stands today. On November 20th, 2025, Washington National Cathedral hosted a ceremony that wasn't just about saying goodbye to Dick Cheney. It was about witnessing the end of an entire era of American politics. But here's what nobody is talking about. This funeral exposed the deepest fractures in our political system, showed us exactly which Republicans are still standing after the Trump takeover, and demonstrated how a man who left office with a 13% approval rating somehow became a symbol of bipartisan unity. The guest list alone tells a story that most Americans don't fully understand yet. In this video, I'm going to break down the 3 most revealing aspects of Cheney's funeral that explain where American politics is heading. First, why Trump and his inner circle weren't invited, and what that means for the future of the Republican Party. Second, how a vice president who was once called the most dangerous in American history ended up being mourned by Democrats and Republicans together. And third, what Cheney's death symbolizes about the complete transformation of conservative politics in America. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand why this funeral wasn't just a ceremony, but a political earthquake that reveals the fault lines running through our democracy. But before we dive into what happened at that cathedral, let me show you exactly why Dick Cheney's story matters so much for understanding where we are today. Dick Cheney didn't just serve as vice president. He redefined what that position could be. For 8 years, under George W. Bush, Cheney operated as what many historians now call the most influential White House advisor in an era of terrorism, war, and economic upheaval. While most vice presidents cut ribbons and attend state funerals, Cheney was architecting the entire war on terror, shaping intelligence policy, and wielding executive power in ways that fundamentally changed how our government operates. This is a man who told reporters in 2005 that he believed in a strong, robust executive authority, and that over the years there had been an erosion of presidential power that needed to be restored. What he meant by that became clear through his actions. Cheney circumvented congressional oversight, instructed subordinates to transmit raw intelligence directly to his office instead of through normal channels, and defended domestic surveillance programs that operated without judicial warrants. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The same man who expanded executive power beyond anything we'd seen before, who defended waterboarding as perfectly acceptable, and who left office with approval ratings in the basement, somehow became the conscience of the Republican Party when it came to defending democracy itself. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. During Trump's 2016 campaign, Cheney was initially critical, but later endorsed the future president. However, Trump's rejection of traditional GOP foreign policy, the very foundation that Cheney had helped build, created an irreparable rift. The breaking point came after the 2020 election when both Dick and Liz Cheney declared Trump a threat to democracy itself. This wasn't just political disagreement. This was a complete philosophical break. In a 2022 campaign advertisement, Cheney said something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He declared that in our nation's 246-year history, there had never been an individual who was a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. Think about that for a moment. A man who had served through the Cold War, who had witnessed the rise and fall of dictatorships around the world, who had navigated some of the most dangerous periods in American history, was saying that a fellow Republican president posed the greatest threat to our system of government that he had ever seen. Trump's response was swift and brutal. He called Cheney an irrelevant rhino, attacked his daughter Liz, and during the 2024 campaign even suggested that Liz Cheney should face combat with guns trained on her. The feud escalated to the point where Trump said, and I quote, Let's put her with a rifle, standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. Let's see how she feels about it when the guns are trained to her face. This brings us to November 20th, 2025, and that cathedral filled with more than 1,000 guests. But here's what made this funeral so extraordinary. It wasn't just who was there, but who wasn't there, and what that absence revealed about the current state of American politics. The guest list read like a who's who of pre-Trump Washington. Former presidents George W. Bush and Joe Biden sat together, along with former vice presidents Kamala Harris, Mike Pence, Al Gore, and Dan Quayle. Supreme Court justices, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and former Leader Mitch McConnell all paid their respects. Even liberal political commentator Rachel Maddow was in attendance, her presence reflecting the political realignment that has reshaped our entire political landscape. But Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were nowhere to be seen. They weren't invited. A White House official confirmed that Trump was not on the guest list, and the administration's response to Cheney's death was notably muted. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt simply noted that Trump was aware of the former vice president's passing, and that flags had been lowered to half-staff. This absence speaks volumes about where we are as a country. Here was a funeral that brought together Democrats and Republicans, former rivals who found common ground in honoring a man they had once opposed. Joe Biden, who had called Cheney the most dangerous vice president in American history, now honored his commitment to his family and values. Meanwhile, the current Republican president couldn't even attend the funeral of one of the most significant conservative figures of the past 50 years. What we witnessed at that cathedral was essentially a gathering of the old guard, the remnants of a political establishment that once governed this country through shared norms and mutual respect, even amid fierce disagreements. These were the politicians who understood that democracy depends not just on winning elections, but on accepting the legitimacy of the system itself. Cheney's career spanned decades of American political history. He served as Chief of Staff to President Gerald Ford in the 1970s, represented Wyoming in Congress for more than a decade, and served as Secretary of Defense under the first President Bush, where he played a crucial role in shaping the Gulf War response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Between government positions, he ran Halliburton, receiving a $33.7 million severance package when he left to become vice president. But it was his role as the architect of the Iraq War that defined his legacy and ultimately led to his political isolation. Cheney was the driving force behind the invasion, making aggressive warnings about Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction and alleged links to al-Qaeda. He stated with absolute certainty that there was no doubt Saddam Hussein possessed these weapons, claims that congressional reports and post-war inquiries later showed were exaggerated or based on faulty intelligence. The human and financial costs of that decision were staggering. The Iraq War cost the United States well over $1 trillion, potentially up to $3 trillion, when considering the wider regional conflict it sparked. Iraqi civilian deaths numbered as high as 600,000 according to some estimates, and the broader post-9/11 conflicts cost $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. Yet, even as these costs became clear, even as his approval ratings plummeted to historic lows, Cheney never wavered in his conviction that he had made the right choices. He continued to defend enhanced interrogation techniques that critics called torture, supported holding terror suspects without trial at Guantanamo Bay, and maintained that the expansion of executive power was necessary to protect American security. This unwavering certainty, this absolute conviction in his own judgment, is what made Cheney such a polarizing figure throughout his career. But it's also what made his transformation so remarkable, because when Cheney looked at Donald Trump, he saw something that violated every principle he had spent his career defending. not the expansion of executive power, which Cheney had championed, but the complete abandonment of constitutional norms that he believed were essential to American democracy. The funeral revealed this transformation in ways that most Americans haven't fully grasped yet. Here was a ceremony where traditional enemies found themselves on the same side, united not by ideology but by their shared commitment to democratic institutions. The presence of Rachel Maddow, a fierce critic of Cheney's policies, alongside Republican stalwarts like George W. Bush, illustrated how the political landscape has been completely redrawn. This realignment didn't happen overnight. It began during the 2020 election when Cheney watched Trump's attempts to overturn the results. For a man who had spent decades accumulating and wielding power within the system, Trump's actions represented something fundamentally different. This wasn't about policy disagreements or political strategy. This was about the survival of the republic itself. The absence of Trump and his allies from the funeral ceremony exposed the depth of this divide. We're not just talking about different wings of the same party anymore. We're talking about two completely incompatible visions of what American democracy should look like. One side believes in the institutions, procedures, and norms that have governed our country for centuries, even when those institutions produce outcomes they don't like. The other side views those same institutions as obstacles to be overcome by any means necessary. Cheney's daughter, Liz, embodied this conflict in the most dramatic way possible. She accepted Nancy Pelosi's invitation to serve as vice chair of the House January 6th committee, putting herself directly in opposition to her own party's leadership. For this decision, she paid the ultimate political price, losing her Wyoming primary to a Trump-backed challenger by one of the largest margins in congressional history. But here's what makes this story so compelling. The same family that had wielded Republican power for decades was now being cast out of the party for defending the very democratic principles that Republicans had claimed to champion. Dick Cheney's endorsement of Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election wasn't just a personal decision. It was a recognition that the battle lines had shifted so dramatically that traditional party loyalty had become irrelevant. The funeral guest list told this story without words. Former presidents Clinton and Obama declined to attend, with Clinton citing an event in Arkansas. Their absence highlighted another dimension of this political realignment. Even Democrats who had opposed Cheney's policies throughout his career recognized the significance of what his death represented. What we witnessed at Washington National Cathedral was essentially a memorial service for a particular kind of American politics. The attendees represented what political scientists call the Washington establishment, the network of politicians, staffers, and influencers who had governed the country through both Republican and Democratic administrations for decades. These were people who understood that democracy requires more than just winning elections. It requires accepting defeat gracefully, respecting the legitimacy of your opponents, and maintaining faith in the system even when it doesn't produce your preferred outcomes. This establishment had its flaws, and Cheney himself embodied many of them. His expansion of executive power, his role in launching costly and controversial wars, his defense of interrogation techniques that violated international law, all of these decisions contributed to the erosion of public trust that eventually made Trump's rise possible. The same secrecy and lack of accountability that Cheney championed in the name of national security created the conditions for even greater abuses of power. But there's a crucial difference between Cheney's approach to power and Trump's approach. Cheney believed he was expanding executive authority to protect American democracy from external threats. Trump used similar powers to attack American democracy from within. Cheney operated within a framework of constitutional government. Even when he pushed the boundaries of that framework, Trump rejected the framework entirely when it no longer served his purposes. This distinction explains why so many former critics found themselves respecting Cheney in his final years, even if they never forgave his earlier actions. His willingness to sacrifice his political future and his family's standing within the Republican Party to oppose Trump demonstrated a commitment to principles that transcended partisan loyalty. The transformation of Dick Cheney from one of the most reviled figures in American politics to a symbol of principled conservatism reveals something profound about our current moment. We're living through a period when traditional political categories no longer apply, when the fundamental questions aren't about tax rates or foreign policy, but about whether our democratic institutions will survive. The funeral ceremony itself reflected this new reality. The eulogies focused not on Cheney's policy achievements or his political victories, but on his character, his integrity, and his willingness to stand up for what he believed was right. Speakers from both parties praised his devotion to family, his service to country, and his courage in facing political exile rather than compromising his principles. This emphasis on character over ideology represents a significant shift in how we evaluate political leaders. For decades, American politics operated on the assumption that policy disagreements, no matter how intense, took place within a shared framework of democratic norms. Politicians could disagree about the size of government or the proper role of American power abroad while still accepting the basic rules of the game. That assumption no longer holds. The presence of bipartisan mourners at Cheney's funeral, united in their respect for a man many of them had opposed throughout his career, demonstrated that the real divide in American politics is no longer between left and right, but between those who accept democratic norms and those who don't. This realignment has profound implications for the future of American politics. The Republican Party that Dick Cheney helped build and lead for decades no longer exists in any recognizable form. The party that once prided itself on constitutional conservatism, fiscal responsibility, and American leadership abroad, has been replaced by something entirely different. The politicians who gathered at that cathedral represented the remnants of a movement that believed in limited government, strong institutions, and the rule of law. Today's Republican Party operates on completely different principles, prioritizing loyalty to a single leader over commitment to constitutional governance. This transformation didn't happen because of policy disagreements or ideological shifts. It happened because one man decided that democratic norms were optional when they conflicted with his personal interests. The speed and completeness of this transformation shocked even seasoned political observers who thought they understood how American politics worked. Consider what happened to the Cheney family within their own party. Dick Cheney had been a Republican power broker for 50 years. He had served in the highest levels of government under 3 different Republican presidents. His daughter Liz was considered rising star in the party leadership, representing one of the most reliably Republican states in the nation. Within 2 years, both of them had been effectively expelled from the party they had served their entire careers. This wasn't gradual political evolution. This was a purge. Anyone who questioned Trump's version of events about the 2020 election, anyone who suggested that January 6th represented a serious threat to democratic governance, anyone who maintained that constitutional principles should constrain presidential power, found themselves on the outside looking in. The party that had once celebrated Cheney's expansion of executive authority now demanded absolute submission to executive power, but only when that power was wielded by the right person. The funeral revealed how this purge had reshaped not just the Republican Party, but the entire political landscape. The Democrats who attended weren't there to celebrate Cheney's policy legacy. Many of them had spent years opposing everything he stood for. They were there because they recognized that he represented something that had become precious in American politics: the willingness to put country over party when democratic institutions were under threat. This recognition came at enormous personal cost to Cheney and his family. Political exile is never easy, but it's particularly difficult for someone who had spent decades accumulating influence within the system. Cheney didn't just lose his standing within the Republican Party. He lost his ability to shape the conservative movement he had helped build. He watched as institutions he had strengthened were turned against the very principles he believed they were meant to protect. Yet he never wavered in his conviction that defending democratic norms was more important than maintaining political power. This consistency, this refusal to bend when it would have been politically advantageous to do so, is what ultimately earned him the respect of former enemies and the lasting enmity of former allies. The funeral ceremony highlighted another aspect of this political transformation that most Americans haven't fully grasped. The people mourning Dick Cheney weren't just Republicans and Democrats. They were representatives of what political scientists call the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy that keeps the government functioning regardless of which party controls the White House. These were career public servants, intelligence officials, military leaders, and diplomatic personnel who had worked under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Their presence at the funeral sent a clear message about where the permanent government stands in the current political moment. These are people who have dedicated their careers to serving American interests regardless of partisan politics. They understand that effective governance requires continuity, expertise, and respect for institutional knowledge. The Trump administration's hostility toward this permanent bureaucracy represented a fundamental threat to their understanding of how government should function. Dick Cheney's funeral wasn't just the end of a political career. It was the final chapter of an entire approach to American governance. What we witnessed at Washington National Cathedral was a gathering of the last believers in a system that no longer exists, mourning not just a man but the very idea that democracy can survive when institutions matter more than individuals. The empty seats where Trump and his allies should have been sitting tell us everything we need to know about where this country is heading, and frankly, it should terrify every American who still believes that our republic can endure.